The following program is an original production of WYCC PBS Chicago.
Welcome to the Chicago Bar Association's Justice and Law Weekly. I am Patricia Brown Holmes, President of the Chicago Bar Association. I'm honored to welcome Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, as my guest. According to Time magazine, Justice Ginsburg is an icon and one of the 100 most influential people of 2015. She has inspired an opera, t-shirts, blogs, and tattoos. Natalie Portman will portray her in an upcoming movie. She has broken many glass ceilings, and she's been a powerful advocate for gender equality. Welcome to Chicago, Justice Ginsburg.
Thank you so much.
So, rock star is often associated with your name for all age groups. Tumblr has a site dedicated to you. The Notorious RBG is a nickname. Mugs, tattoos. Saturday Night Live has even parodied you. Glamour magazine called you the Supreme Force. You grew up in Brooklyn. Did you always know you would be an icon?
It's amazing what has become of me. As a girl growing up in Brooklyn, my highest aspiration was to be a high school teacher. I never dreamed of being a lawyer, no less a judge.
Fantastic. You indicated at one point that Amelia Earhart and Nancy Drew were your inspirations. How did that come about? How did they influence you?
They were doers. In the ancient days when I went to school, there was Dick and Jane readers. Dick was out there doing things, and Jane was the quiet, passive one. But Nancy Drew was the dominant person. The boyfriend tagged along, and Amelia Earhart was up in the air doing something brave, extraordinary for any person, man or woman. So I admired them, one fictional, one real, because they did things.
Did you read all the Nancy Drew series? I know I love Nancy Drew.
I can't say I read all of them, but probably most of them.
Well, let's talk a little bit about how it all started for you in Brooklyn. You grew up to loving parents, Celia and Nathan Bader. Your father was an immigrant from Russia. Can you discuss a little bit about your parents and any influence they may have had on your life?
My father, as you said, came from Russia when he was 13. My mother was the first person in her large family born in the USA. She was conceived in the Old World, and 4 months after her mother arrived in New York, her mother gave birth to my mother. She was an enormous influence on me. Sadly, she was taken much too soon. She died when I was 17, the day before I was to graduate from high school.
It must have been hard.
But she instilled in me two thoughts. One was be independent. That is, I think she hoped I would one day meet Prince Charming, but in the meantime, or in any event, I should be independent, self-sufficient. The other, she called be a lady. And what being a lady meant was don't get ruffled, never react in anger. Jealousy is an emotion that will waste your time and not be productive. Remorse as well. So those two ideas really have guided my life. One, to be self-standing, and the other, not to react in anger, not to engage in self-defeating emotions.
How successful have you been in following your mother's advice?
For the most part, I think I've been pretty successful, but I also had some wonderful advice from my mother-in-law. My husband and I met at Cornell University. It was my first year, his second year. And when I graduated, the week after I graduated, we were married. We were married in his parents' home. My mother-in-law took me aside just before the ceremony and said, "Dear, I'd like to give you some advice about a happy marriage." Yes? What is it? Sometimes it helps to be a little deaf. Now, that's advice that I have followed not only in my marriage of 56 years, but in dealing with my colleagues at the court. It does help sometimes just not to hear an unkind word.
So just to pretend you didn't hear it at
Yes.
all. So let's talk a little bit about your husband. You've already indicated that you met at Cornell, and he was one of your biggest cheerleaders. You and he were attracted almost immediately. Is that right?
He was my best friend before he became my husband. Yes.
And once you were married, as you indicated before you graduated school, who handled all of the day-to-day chores around the house, the cooking and cleaning?
Well, we were fortunate to be both students when we were married. So we spent the first 2 years of our married life in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, because he was doing military service. And then we went to Harvard Law School. When we started Harvard, our daughter was 14 months old. But because we were both students, it was natural to share the homework. Now, the cooking was something else. In our marriage, I was the everyday cook, and he was the weekend and company cook. Marty was a master chef.
Fantastic.
He had been, originally at Cornell, he had been a chemistry major, but chemistry labs interfered with golf practice. He was a great golfer. So he ended up majoring in government, as I did. But he retained from chemistry the ability to deal with formulas, and the formulas became recipes. My cousin, as a joke, sent him an English translation of the great chef Escoffier, of his cookbook. And Marty started with page 1, the basic stocks, and then he graduated. So at the end of our 2 years in service, he was quite an accomplished cook. But I was every day, and I had one cookbook. He has, when he died, we had 3 complete shelves floor to ceiling
Oh,
of
my
just
goodness.
cookbooks. He was a tax lawyer, and he had as many cookbooks as he did tax tomes.
Well, let's talk a little bit. I want to backtrack. You mentioned being at Harvard
Yes,
and having a child.
yes.
That had to be difficult.
I attribute my success in law school in large measure to my daughter, because we had a babysitter, a New England nanny type, who came in when I left for classes in the morning and then left at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I worked very hard during the day. When I came home, the law books were replaced by the park or playing games with my child. It was such a break in my life. When she went to sleep, I went back to the books. But I thought that each part of my life was a respite from the other. when I had my fill of reading law books and I had a child to attend to. When she went to sleep, I was happy to go back to studying law. And I think I had a perspective, a distance. Some first-year law students get overwhelmed by the law studies.
You were
I
law
think-
review, right?
Yes, but there was a balance in my life, and it was a healthy balance. So yes, I was on law review, and in my last year, I transferred to Columbia. So I was on the Columbia Law Review after having been on the Harvard Law Review. Now,
First woman to ever-
when I go abroad, some people are tremendously impressed. What, Harvard Law Review, Columbia Law Review? They don't know these are student publications.
Well, but it's still impressive. You know, I believe you might be the first woman to ever have been on 2 law reviews like that. Is that correct?
Yes, but that's only because I transferred law schools.
And at the time, I believe you were one of only 9 women in your class at
Yeah.
Harvard. Over 500 men.
Over 500 men and 9 of us, yes.
Well, you know, can you talk to us a little bit about how that felt?
You felt that all eyes were on you. So you had to be super prepared, because if you gave a wrong answer, you would be failing not just for yourself, but for your entire sex. So I can explain the difference this way. Now we have to fast forward many years. It's in the 1970s. Women are beginning to come to law schools in numbers. And one of my colleagues on the Columbia Law School faculty said he had a certain longing for the not-so-good old days when women were barely there. He said when the class was moving slowly and you wanted to get a crisp, right answer, you called on the woman. She was always prepared, and then you could move on with your plan for the class. Nowadays, he said, there's no difference. The women are as unprepared as the men.
Oh my goodness.
So that was it. Women feel comfortable being in law school. There are a lot of women there these days, but in the old days, we did feel that all eyes were on us, and we had to be better prepared than the men.
That extra preparation always works.
Then there was the famous dinner that the law school dean gave. He invited all of the women in the first year class, all 9 of us, plus each of us was escorted by a distinguished faculty member. And after we had a dinner that was not so distinguished, we came to his living room, and he had the chairs arranged in a horseshoe. And he asked us the question, now tell me, what are you doing at the Harvard Law School occupying a seat that could be held by a man?
Oh my goodness.
Well, this dean years later explained to me that he didn't ask the question to insult or to wound. He had been a partisan of the admission of women to the Harvard Law School. Women weren't admitted until the year 1950.
Mm-hmm.
So I got there in 1956, and there were still doubting Thomases on the faculty who thought it was a mistake
Oh, wow.
to admit women. So he asked this question of the women in the entering class. So he would be armed with stories to tell his colleagues. Now these women will do something useful
Wonderful.
with their law degrees. So that's
Did he get good stories?
well. Well, the best answer came from one of my classmates who said, "Dean Griswold, there are 9 of us. Well, really only 8, because Ruth Ginsburg doesn't count for this purpose. There are over 500 of them. What better place to find a man?"
You already had
So,
one.
so
I'm sure after graduation, the offers were just pouring in. Here you are, a young woman having graduated from Columbia, law review at Harvard. Tell us about all of the offers that came pouring in from the law firms.
And there were 0 offers. My mother-in-law had bought for me a beautifully tailored black suit that I wore to all the interviews. These were the interviews held at Columbia. Only 2 of the firms invited me to come to their offices for a second interview. Neither of those gave me an offer. I explain it by saying I had 3 strikes against me. One, I was Jewish, and the law firms, the large law firms, were just beginning to be receptive to Jewish associates. Then being a woman, that was a much more severe burden, but a few law firms were willing to take a chance on a woman. But my 3rd strike did me in. I was a mother.
Oh.
And if they were willing to take a chance on a woman, they were certainly not yet ready to take a chance on a woman. So I had no offers. So how did I get a job? I had a wonderful professor for federal courts at Columbia, Jerry Gunther. He was in charge of clerkships for Columbia students. He approached a judge who always took Columbia graduates as his clerks. And the judge said, well, her record is good, but how can I risk a mother? What will happen if I need her on a Saturday or a Sunday or late at night? Professor Gunther gave this judge an offer he couldn't refuse. He said, give her a chance, and if she doesn't work out, there's a young man in her class who is going to a Wall Street law firm, and he will come in and take over. So that's the carrot. There was a stick as well.
Okay.
And the stick was, if you don't give her a chance, I will never recommend another Columbia graduate to you. So
That was
on with
powerful.
that. And this was typical of the women of my generation. The first job was powerfully hard to find.
Mm-hmm.
When you got the job, you did it better than the men. And the second job, the doors were open. The same was true of Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. She graduated top of her class at Stanford Law School. No one would offer her a job as a lawyer. So instead of feeling sorry for herself, she went to a county attorney and said, I'll work for you without pay for 4 months.
Free.
And then if you think I'm worth it, you can put me on the payroll. So that's how she got her foot in the door.
So I take it she got on the payroll. Well, so let's talk a little bit about the work-life balance. It sounds like you did very well with a child in law school, a husband. Sounds like you were one of the only women in your class who happened to be married at the time. Nowadays, though, many young professionals find it very difficult to manage a marriage, a career, children. You were given some advice. What advice would you give them?
Whatever the difficulties are, they pale in comparison to the way it was. When we moved to New York, I was attending Columbia Law School. My husband was working for a large law firm. There were only 2 nursery schools in that entire area, and they would take a child from 9 to 12 or 2 to 5. That was it. My daughter, when she became a member of the Columbia Law School faculty, this is many years ago, about 30 years ago, there were many full-day daycare facilities in the area. I see it in D.C. So many workplaces have not just emergency temporary daycare, but full daycare. Georgetown Law School, where my husband taught, has a wonderful nursery for
Fantastic.
children from a Georgetown community and from the neighborhood. So, but it does take something more, and that is to have a supportive partner. The writer Norman Mailer once said, "A woman could be bending over a sink full of dishes, and I wouldn't lift a finger to help her unless I thought her work was as important as mine." And Marty always felt that way about me. He was my biggest booster.
He felt that your work was just as important as anything else.
There were balances in our life at different times. When he was a young lawyer and he was climbing the partnership ladder, and he was determined to do it in 5 years, which he did, I took on the lion's share of the homework and the child care. But later in life, when I became a judge of the Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, moved from New York to Washington, any number of people asked me, "Isn't it hard to commute between New York and D.C.?" I said, "What makes you think I'm commuting?" We moved to D.C., and Marty, who had just left practice and had become a professor of taxation at Columbia Law School, he transferred to the Georgetown Law School faculty. That first year on the bench, when we were introduced at a social event, and the introducer said, this is Judge Ginsburg," and more often than not, the hand went out to Marty.
Oh my goodness.
No, nobody, when I was appointed to the Supreme Court, that nobody mistook Marty for being
the judge.
being the justice.
You tell a funny story, but very poignant, about your son and being called to school by the teacher.
Yes.
Can you tell us about that?
My son, James, was what I called a lively child. His teachers called him hyperactive. He was constantly getting into trouble in school, and I would be called at least once a month to come down to discuss with the school principal, room teacher, school psychologist, my son's latest escapade. One day, I was sitting in my office at Columbia. I had stayed up all night writing a brief, and I was weary. So I responded, "This child has 2 parents. Please alternate calls." And this time it's his father's turn. So Marty went down to the school, and he faced 3 stone faces, the principal, the psychologist, the room teacher. What was the crime my son had committed? "Your son stole the elevator." Well, Marty's response was, how far could he take it? Stole the elevator. There was a handheld elevator in those days, and people still smoked. The elevator operator went out for a cigarette. One of my son's classmates dared him to take a group of kindergartners up to the top floor, which he did. And when he got there, he was met by the janitor and promptly reported for his grave offense. Anyway, whether it was Marty's sense of humor or the reluctance of the school to call a man away from his work, we got calls barely once a term. There was no great change in my son's lively behavior, but there was huge reluctance to call a man away from his work.
Well, I can imagine that that was something good for you because you didn't have to go up to the school as often.
Yes.
Well, I'd love to talk to you a little bit about some of the clerkships that you've done and some of the books that you've written. We have a few more minutes here, and so what I would like for you to talk a little bit about is the book that you co-wrote on judicial procedure in Sweden.
Oh, goodness. Yes. After my clerkship, I said doors were open. I could have gotten a job with a firm. In fact, I did. And then a professor from Columbia asked me to have lunch with him at the Harvard Club. By the way, in those days, this is 1961, I had to enter by the side door because women weren't allowed to go through the main door. There was a little red door on the side. We had lunch, and he said, "Ruth, how would you like to write a book about judicial procedure in Sweden?" Well, at that point, I wasn't quite sure I knew where Sweden was in comparison to Norway. But the idea was intriguing. So here I was, 29 years old. I would have a book hard-covered book that I would author. I would have an opportunity to learn Swedish, and then to live in a country alone. I had never lived on my own. I had been in a college dormitory and then got married the next week. So it was kind of the 8-year itch for me. I went off to Sweden after studying the language for nearly a year. And I lived by myself for 6 weeks. And then Marty, my husband, sent my daughter, Jane, to be with me. I found that, yes, I could manage little things that we were worried about. Marty always paid the check at the restaurant, the taxi cab, and I wasn't sure that I would be able to figure that kind of thing out quickly. So I was well satisfied after those 6 weeks that I could manage on my own, but I much rather be together with my husband. So the Swedish adventure lasted 2 years, and then I joined in the project was the project on international procedure. The book, there was a companion book about international judicial assistance. Okay. That is, suppose you have a case going on in the United States and you need the testimony of a witness in Europe, or you need to serve process abroad. So this book is about the facilities that are available to a U.S. lawyer abroad to gather evidence or to serve process, and then reciprocally what the United States offered to foreign lawyers who were conducting proceedings abroad if they wanted documents, deposition, to serve papers in the United States. So I went to Finland, Norway, Denmark as part of that effort.
That's fantastic. Well, we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. Right now, I'd like to thank you for sharing with us how you became the notorious RBG. And we'll talk a little bit more later about some of the things that you've done once you got on the bench. I'm Patricia Brown Holmes, and thank you for watching the Chicago Bar Association's Justice and Law Weekly program. Thank you. Join us next time.